listening to Consulting Logistics, presented by Aborn and Company. I'm your host, Tim Dooner. Thank you for pressing that play button today. We're joined in studio by our very own Steve Aborn to talk about the importance of data capture in the supply chain. If you haven't even started thinking about data or have just begun your research, then this is the show for you. We're going to outline why data capture is important, the issues with the state of data capture in the supply chain now, and we'll reveal our clever solution to this problem that's at nearly an industry-wide epidemic level. Steve's worked for companies such as Amazon and now is a driving force behind our supply chain innovation initiatives. Not to mention, a Harvard graduate where he played football for 4 years. Go Crimson! Steve, thank you for coming in the studio today.
Thanks, Tim. Happy to be here. I've heard a lot of consulting logistics over the last couple of months and excited to make my debut.
Yeah, I know. I really wanted to get you on here because this is right in your wheelhouse. You and I have been working very hard on this project, coming up with a solution, and we think we just may have one for the listeners. But before we even get there, let's talk a little bit about your background, right? You went to Harvard. You worked for Amazon. What is some of your philosophy here at Aborn now that you're here? And let us into your background.
Sure. After college, I went to work for Amazon. In college, I did some internships in investment banking, did some internships in wealth management, worked a lot in the finance field in college, and kind of saw myself going to New York like a lot of my peers. And then one of my good friends, a kid that I played football with in college, one of my best friends, he went out and worked for Amazon. They had just started an undergraduate retail recruiting program. So I figured I would interview, maybe get a free trip out to Seattle, visit my friend, be someplace I had never been. And so I applied. Went through kind of a couple of phone screens, went out to Seattle and did an in-person interview, and I just loved it. I loved the interview structure. I loved how collaborative it was. The interview was fun. For anyone who's familiar with finance interviews, they're not fun. So I just thought the environment and the way the people that you're able to work with, the way that they work together rather than, in opposition, really appealed to me. So I changed it up. I went out to Seattle, worked there for about 2.5 years. The first year I was working in kind of an interesting role. The way they set it up there is on an entry level, you work with one major company and you're doing everything from marketing, you're doing supply chain management, you're doing vendor negotiations, you're really, exposed to a ton of stuff at a young age. So I was doing that for about a year. One of the things about Amazon is that they're constantly understaffed.
Wow.
It's a heavy rotation culture. So after 18 months to 24 months, you're looking for your next role. So it leaves a lot of teams it kind of in a state of rapid, constant change. We had an opportunity where we had a bunch of people rotate off of our team, and I was kind of pushed into this supply chain management role. So I went from, typical kind of college kid, first year out of school working, and then I found myself getting promoted pretty quickly and managing about $275 million worth of cookware and bakeware inventory. So really got thrown into the fire pretty quickly and loved it. Amazon was a great place to work. Highly competitive. Had really a great foundation for learning business. If you talk to any former Amazonian, they're going to tell you about the Amazon leadership principles. And I think that's one thing that they do a great job really drilling into employees. And one thing that we've tried to bring here, if you think about the ways that they work with data and they capture, store, and use information in their data analysis, and then how they bring that value to their customers. I mean, that's really the core of the Amazon value proposition is, understanding complex problems, using data to understand them, and then bringing great customer experiences. And I think that's what we've been trying to recreate here for the last couple of years, and I think we're doing a pretty good job.
In Seattle, I know I always sort of insert some sort of movie trivia into these shows, but we were having a conversation, and kind of in passing as a joke, I mentioned Sleepless in Seattle, but to my surprise, you had an answer to that, right?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. So when I took the job, like anyone else, you got to figure out when you move where you're going to live. So I actually drove from Boston out to Seattle. It's a pretty easy drive. You get on the 90 in Boston, you take the Mass Pike all the way to Seattle, Washington, straight across the country. So I had a place that I was settled with about 5 of my friends, some of the kids I knew and some that I didn't. My dad and I were in about Minnesota, and I got a call that the place was only zoned for 4 people. So our apartment fell apart. We had no place to live. So I was moving to a new city with my first job, and I had no place to live, and I was about 1,500 miles away. So I actually ended up meeting somebody who was joining the program that I was in, the retail undergraduate program, and he offered me a spot on his houseboat. So the first 2 months I was out there, it was beautiful. It was the middle of the summer. Seattle summers are glorious. After 8 months of dreary weather and rain and all that fun Seattle weather, the summers really are spectacular. So I spent my first 2 months on a houseboat, and at the end of the houseboat lane was the Sleepless in Seattle house. So I stayed about 4 houseboats down from where Sleepless in Seattle was filmed when I first moved to Seattle.
Wow.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you worked in a great proving ground, Amazon, one of the innovators in supply chain and logistics. Whatever they do, people take notice.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think when you think about the leadership principles and the way that they attack business problems, it's really only a matter of time before they get into an industry, and take it over. I think you've started to see that over the last couple of years, where they're now buying trucks, they're buying planes, they're buying additional warehouses. They're really investing in supply chain.
Well, when you have all that freight to move, you have a lot of data. And it's no secret that this has been a challenging year for freight. E-com, ELDs, and driver shortages all combined to create a capacity crisis and have sent rates soaring to record highs. Trade agreements are getting ripped up and reformed seemingly every week, and tons of money is pouring into data-driven tech solutions like TMS, IoT, blockchain, autonomous trucks. There's a lot of meat on the bone this year, Steve. What's been some of your takeaways, though? Because I think this has been one of the more interesting and exciting years in logistics I've experienced.
Yeah, really since about last August, September time when the hurricanes started to hit, we've been in a really, really tough market. We have a lot of industry veterans in our office who have been working here, working in the industry for 25, 30, 40 years even. And a lot of them will tell you that this is one of the worst markets that they've ever seen. That's a large sample size for it to be the worst market that they've ever seen. We've heard that feedback from carriers over and over and over again. I think the real challenge that they have in talking to the carriers is the drivers. And I think where they've started to turn to look for solutions is, how can we be more productive and efficient in other parts of our business? How do we work with our customers better so that we can be more efficient, so that we can provide a greater level of service, even though we have this pretty massive constraint of not enough drivers to drive trucks, right? You're kind of starting with a leg down as opposed to a leg up if you're a trucking company right now. So I think, one thing that they've made really clear over the last year as they've been doing well, a lot of trucking companies are reporting record profits, but I think one thing that they're doing is they're investing for the future, and they're trying to communicate that to the market. Companies need to be able to work in a digital atmosphere and in a digital environment to work well with carriers. That's the way the industry is going to go, because they don't really have any other choice.
Yeah, and it seems like people aren't willing to really do two things, right? Wait around for carriers to hire a bunch of employees, and also wait for them to get up to date on tech, because it's been a long wait for carriers to get there. But now on the market, there's solutions that can handle that without having to take the control back in your supply chain and let someone else manage it for you.
Yeah, I think one thing about the carriers is that if you think about this industry, it's a little bit of a challenging industry. If you think about, this is an $800 billion a year industry, $750 to $800 billion a year. And the top 50 providers have about 25% market segment share. If you think about other industries of that size, think about your cell phone. You may only have, 3-4 options for a cell phone provider. Those companies are able to generate a lot of cash and then invest that in the user experience. Where there are so many trucking companies and the average trucking company has less than 25 trucks available, it's very difficult for those companies to heavily invest in technology, in data-driven processes, in plausible methods to move away from email and cell phone and fax communication. So I think it's really been great to see the carriers and hear them talking about kind of forward thinking, because I don't think you're ever going to get to the point of having a truly efficient supply chain if the bulk of carriers are still managing their workflows in faxes and phone calls.
Yeah, absolutely, especially the fax machine. We need to decommission the fax machine. There needs to be like a national initiative to decommission fax machines. Decommission fax machines 2020, get on board, right? But, you make a great point, and I think it's become apparent that there needs to be a symbiotic relationship between a shipper's physical freight and the data footprint that it creates. But first of all, there's an issue with the fragmentation, but why is it important that we get this data to begin with? I mean, we hear data all the time, but what does that even mean? What are people going to do with data?
Sure. Going back to the Amazon days, I think if you're going to improve any process, the first place that you need to start is by measuring and really understanding every single part of the process. So if you think about right now where, somebody might send an email to a carrier and say, hey, I have 5 pallets for 5,000 pounds. I need it from this zip to that zip. And then all that transaction history, think about all the things that have to happen in the life cycle of that tender being sent to the carrier to that freight being delivered. There's a whole lot of information in physical movement of goods that has to happen. And right now, no one's really storing that in a meaningful way. So I think the goal for shippers is to really start to understand from the time that an order comes in from one of your customers to the time that you deliver it to that customer, what is happening? Are you able to measure every part, every small facet of the movement in the supply chain, the way that it's moving throughout the country, the amount of times it's stopping at a terminal? I think the first step for improving any process is really starting to get a grasp on what's happening. So once you understand what's happening, then you can start to come up with some strategies on how to fix it. So briefly to answer your question, the reason that you have to have improved data systems is so that you can measure and improve your supply chain. I mean, it's that simple.
Yeah, I think I've stressed this many times in articles, but if you are the transportation manager for a company and you don't have clean data, then how are you to know that you're doing the best job for your supply chain or the best job managing the supply chain? One of the reasons it's so hard to get clean data, as we're just about to touch on, is, as you mentioned earlier, there's so many carriers, there's so many brokers, so many different data lakes and data sources that shippers are receiving back. I don't think that they really know how to utilize it yet and use it cross-departmentally and use it even in their transportation department. And you have some insight on this because you and your team audit a lot of data and benchmark nearly every aspect of transportation. When you receive data to do these audits and tailor managed freight solutions for clients, what do you notice about the current state of data capture for most companies?
So we receive data mostly in Excel spreadsheets days, and that's best case scenario. If you talk to our operations teams, there's a number of clients that we have right now where we physically had to go to their location, walk into their financial department and pull freight bills and literally handwrite in freight bills to start to get an idea of where and how their freight moves. I think that's kind of worst case scenario is you have no visibility to data. You have no ability to get any of your data in one meaningful place. But we see it go up and down the spectrum. You'd be surprised at how many large multi-billion-dollar a year companies will be interested in something like a benchmark. So each year we're benchmarking and negotiating about $500 million to $750 million in freight cost. So if you think about that on a line item level, it's a ton of information, right? So we've gotten pretty good at this. You'd be surprised the amount of companies that are doing, $1, $2, $3 billion a year in revenue, whose data is in such a state of disrepair that we aren't able to get, basic levels of information, origin zip codes, destination zip codes, shipper names, vendor partner names, just stuff that you'd think that most companies would be able to have. Even getting cost information a lot of times is very difficult. And what we found is that for a lot of companies, it actually makes more sense to go to their carriers to get data directly from carriers, just because the shippers aren't able to report on it in any meaningful way.
Yeah, your data is your freight now, right? Your data completely represents your freight. It's not just this separate entity that you can pull this and that from. And when we see data in states of disrepair, that seems like what people are doing, and they're not looking at the totality of their data. And I imagine a lot of those companies are also really rate focused, right? They probably go out to bid on rates all of the time. But when we look at data, we don't just look at rates. We look at optimization and other ways that clients can save money, right? And that's where the real story in data lies. How do you put that puzzle together, though, when data is so bad, right? Because it's kind of a little bit of guesswork.
Yeah, sure. You end up pulling from a bunch of different sources. So if somebody, like we said, if somebody has really bad data, you end up going to their carriers a lot of times. And even the carriers, you'd be surprised at what we get back from the carriers. Again, pretty large, sophisticated carriers, and you're getting, somebody will say that they shipped a single pound in an LTL shipment that was 1 million pounds. It just can't be, right? So you'll get a lot of incorrect incorrect data from carriers, from shippers, really from everybody in the industry. And I think that's a real problem. It's a real problem for us as we start to look through some of let's start with rates. It's difficult to compare rates. It's difficult to think about optimization opportunities. A lot of the logistics strategies that we might want to take a look at, you can't even really start to go down that path until you have a real true look at how their freight's moving and what's happening. If you think about potential optimization opportunities, something as simple as a multi-stop truckload, we need to know how much weight was on those LTL shipments or that partial truckload so that we can put something on the back of it, save our clients some cost. So if you don't have really good visibility in numbers that you're really confident in terms of origin points, destination points, costs, weights, potentially cube's a huge part of shipping. Obviously, how much space do your goods take up on a truck? We've been doing this for almost 3 years, and I don't think I've seen a shipper transmit cube to us once.
Yeah, and if this is your purest source of data, for example, if you took some of these spreadsheets that we receive, what would happen if you plugged that into a TMS or, God forbid, like an AI system? It would wreak havoc, right?
Yeah. I think, you bring up a great point that you go to a conference and, these industry conferences, everyone's talking about blockchain and artificial intelligence as the future of the industry and how it's going to solve all these problems in industry, which it absolutely will. But the first step to go down that path is going to be getting some data that an AI algorithm can really put some confidence. This is the cliche of all cliches, but bad data in, bad data out. Could have the most powerful algorithm in the world, but if the inputs to that algorithm are off, then you're not going to be happy with the results. They either won't be plausible for your supply chain, the cost forecast and the way that it'll operate will be wrong. So I think the first step in building toward that long-term vision of the industry of working extensively with machine learning and artificial intelligence and blockchain is really starting to get a hold and put some controls on how data is captured, stored, and transmitted to your business partners.
I'm glad you mentioned conferences because I've been to quite a few conferences this year. We've done surveys. I do a lot of research online. We talk to our business partners. We talk to potential business partners, and we talk to competing businesses and partners in other verticals and the carriers as well. One thing that's been coming up a lot, though, especially out of shippers, is that they have an interest in data and they have an interest in the AI or the blockchain that you mentioned, but they don't know how to get there yet. They see it as a daunting task. There's no roadmap to a beginning of it. There doesn't seem to be any set standards for what they're supposed to follow or best practices. And as you just said, you can't even get to the AI systems or the blockchain systems or even a TMS until you start thinking about how to collect data. You got to take those baby steps first. So it creates a barrier to entry. It creates a barrier to entry in terms of that confusion. But how do shippers who haven't done well in either managing their data or aren't capturing it in a meaningful way, how do they begin to even do that?
Just like the carriers who are investing heavily in systems, digitalization, and the new buzzword that you see a lot is the Amazonification, right? Companies are really interested in where their shipments are at any given time. So I think the easy answer is that you need to invest in some systems, and then you need to work to make sure that those systems speak to each other in a loop, right? It doesn't do you a ton of good to put something through a TMS and then be done with it. You need to put something through a TMS. You need to put a shipment through a TMS, capture all the information in that supply chain, and then put that back in your ERP. How are you ever going to get a fully loaded cost on a product level if you can't store that information on a product level and really understand what those costs are throughout your supply chain? We're talking specifically about transportation here, but the same goes for warehousing and all other aspects of supply chain management, right? Those are big costs for companies. And I think the answer is that you have to have a strategy around it. You have to invest in systems, and you have to get buy-in from your people to use those systems. That's one thing that we've found doing this work and talking to companies and starting to build up some freight management solutions for companies is that we're talking to companies about TMS, and some of them will say that, yeah, well, we invested in TMS 6 years ago. We just don't use it. That's a problem. You need to get buy-in from your people to actually use these systems and make sure that the systems that you're buying are solving the problems that you're really looking to solve. You have to attack the problem from a bunch of different angles. Get your people on board. You have to find the right systems for your business, and you need to make sure that they all talk together.
Yeah, especially, again, we talk about future-proofing your supply chain and moving forward, things like AI. You need the same version of the truth to use an AI system. If you have a warehouse system that has completely different inventory than what you're receiving out of your TMS or your logistics system, you're going to start having big problems there because a computer, AI, it still doesn't have human consciousness. It still has to go and process. It has to process, and it can only go off of the data that we give it and we receive it. But we've noticed that this is a huge problem industry-wide. There's no standards. So we've put our heads together in the collective knowledge within this company, and we think we may have a solution to help some of those shippers get over the goal line, right? Or at least get the ball at kickoff and start the game and start getting in the game and start thinking about the future of supply chain in an easy and refined method. Do you want to talk a little bit about what day one optimization is?
Yeah, sure. We've gotten into fully managed transportation for the last 2.5 years, but the core of our business and where we started 30 years ago was really as a consulting company in the transportation industry. And so as data has become increasingly more important in this industry, and it's really what people want to spend a lot of time talking about. And again, we're consuming so much of that data. If you think about all the line items that go into maybe $750 million worth of freight cost, that's a lot of information. What we decided was we've really become data experts in a lot of ways in the last couple of years, hiring data science, really, making sure that the culture within our walls is data driven. So we thought that we would offer, some consulting services around how to work with data in the supply chain. So when you talk about day one data optimization, that's really what we're starting to do is what we want to do is work with companies to consult them on how to use data in this space, really get started. As you mentioned, a lot of folks at conferences are saying, I like the idea of blockchain, I like the idea of AI, but my purchase orders come over wrong every time, or I can't get my item master to accurately reflect the weights of my products, just basic stuff. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect on their end of how am I ever going to get to artificial intelligence if I can't store and transmit data digitally in a meaningful way right now. So I think that's the work that we want to do with our customers, is really start to dig into their systems, the way that they store data and the way that they transmit data, and offer some best practices, just because that's the work that we've had to really get into recently, and we've developed a proficiency in it.
Yeah, and we're solving that with a pretty, because we talk about that barrier to entry. It seems hard to get into. It seems I don't have the people for this, or I don't have the skills, or I don't have the intelligence. And I think that's something that we really recognize. So with day one, we know that most people's data is messed up. That's why we developed the service to begin with, which, might I add, at least for now, is a free service, completely free service, where we look at your data and we'll let you know what state it's in, and we'll give you our recommendations on what to do next. There's no obligation beyond that. We just recognize that there's a need problem here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're hearing it more and more from our prospects and our clients and other business partners and other people in the industry. So we really want to get into doing that work, helping companies get into the future of supply chain and do some complex shipping methods and really reduce costs in the long term. Because at the end of the day, if you're not able to meaningfully work in a digital atmosphere with your carrier partners, you're not going to have success over the next 5 to 10 years. Carriers won't want to work with you. This is very much the direction that they're going in because their clients are demanding it. So I think it's in a lot of companies' best interest to start investing in this, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, so traditionally in supply chains, we always hear this rate focus. You contact anyone, all they want to talk about is rates. And I think a big part of what we're trying to do here and what we think that shippers need to start doing is rethinking how they think about their supply chain and recontextualizing it. Because you're going to get lower rates and all of this stuff once you optimize your data. And you're going to get all the benefits of future-proofing your supply chain, being able to use AI, bringing in all those other products. But I think what we're noticing now and we're saying here is you can't do it just by throwing out RFPs, right? Or just by spot quoting every single shipment. It almost seems insane to do in 2018.
Yeah, I think even the first step in being a best-in-class supply chain and a best-in-class negotiator on rates is the ability to share data. If you go out to a carrier and say that you have a $50 million annual freight spend in these modes and you want competitive pricing on it, and if you can't detail pretty close to that $50 million where your freight's going, what region's moving in, what weight breaks, what modes, then you're not going to be able to effectively negotiate rates. Blind spots for carriers are a risky investment. So the way that they're hedging against blind spots is by increasing your rates, right? So the greater visibility you can give your carriers in a negotiation, the better off you're going to be. And to your point, that's really the first level. So if you think about rates are your first level, and the next step is really looking at optimum strategies. Without being able to, again, capture and store and work with data in a meaningful way, you're going to fail at negotiating rates. You're going to see higher rates, and you're also going to miss opportunities to drive greater efficiencies in your supply chain.
Yeah, and I think that we, and to the credit to the team that you've built, do such a great job at it that one of actually our biggest hurdles in presentations is explaining how we're able to find millions and millions of savings beyond what I think a lot of traditional 3PLs are. Because again, they're really just stuck straight up in that rate negotiation model where we're thinking, I think in a more sophisticated manner about it, and in a way that I think we're just a little bit ahead. I think it's the way that everybody is going to have to think. We're just putting that thought process and applying that thought process at this stage in the game.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that, going back to Amazon, it all starts and ends with Amazon in this, in this industry. But I think, again, one thing that really we're looking to transfer is that data-driven decision making. If you think about the team of data scientists that we've built here that are working on complex data solutions and optimization strategies and looking at how we do things better in this industry, I think that is the way of the future. And that's really what we're trying to figure out now and bring to the market.
And what is that? So let's just get a clear message out here on what our solution is, because there may be other solutions out here. But the one that we came up as a company with, and the service that we wanted to extend to our listeners and has freight, is we understand your data may be a mess, right? So that's where day one optimization comes in. Again, what day one optimization is about is getting your data in order, letting you know what state it's in, and providing a roadmap for you to follow to get to that next stage, to start future-proofing your supply chain and to provide some guidance. There's just so much market confusion. A lot of shippers are saying to themselves, how do I start? How do I bring in the data? Do you have any recommendations, like beyond day one, beyond selling our own service? Because this is also an informative thing. I mean, and it's not even to sell, because day one is at least free for a limited time. Again, that's day01.io. Check it out. But if you want to start on your own, there might be something that you need to do before you even go over to day one optimization or do something else. And that might be a shift in thinking, right? A shift in philosophy.
Yeah, I think a shift in philosophy for a lot of companies is necessary. The first thing that a shipper has to do is really change the way that they're looking at supply chain. I think a lot of companies are focused in their supply chain at getting freight in the door, storing it, and getting freight out of the door and making sure it's delivered to their customers in a timely manner. And that's important. I don't mean to mitigate the importance of that at all. That at the end of the day, that's what we're all here to do, right? I think there's some more strategies in terms of systems and almost a philosophical change going from really transactional to more of building a long-term strategy. And I think part of any company's long-term strategy has to be, how are we going to be able to get to a best-in-class supply chain when it comes to data? What type of systems are we going to have to invest in? What types of people are we going to have to hire? I think that's one thing that we've found is as we're dealing with more data, more large, complex data sets with a bunch of moving parts, that we have to hire for that. There's a certain skill set that is comfortable working in those, comfortable working in that space, and we've tried to adapt and reflect that with our own hiring patterns. So I think it is a little bit of a philosophical shift going from more of a transactional rate-driven business to a whole broad supply chain strategy.
If someone is interested in day one, tell us the process, because it's designed to be simple, right? So what would someone do today? Because it launches today. It's out now. Go to day01.io, and what do you do when you get there?
Tim, it's really quite simple. So you'd go to day1.io, you put in an email address, and you click Get Optimized. And then what's going to happen is one of our team members with expertise in this area will reach out to you. And we realize that data is obviously a sensitive subject. So if there's an NDA or something that you want to put in place before we exchange information, we're totally comfortable with that. That's we do that for a lot of our prospects and customers. That's kind of a best practice in that area for data security, right? So I think that's really the start of the process. Visit the website, give us your information, and then we'll start the conversation and get you where you want to be.
And the information is only an email. But what about this? What about if I am the transportation manager, I'm not really sure how to get all of my data together, or I'm only willing to give you a sample? Is that something that you guys can work with?
Yeah, absolutely. We can work with really whatever you send, and that'll be part of the output. Take a look at what you sent, and then offer some guidance on what other things you might want to have as part of that data set.
Hundreds of billions are being poured into supply chain technology now, right? There's IoT, there's blockchain, there's AI. And it's scary if you're not prepared for it, but can I just wait? Can I just wait for AI to fix it for me?
No. One of my favorite podcasts that we've done was with IBM, the IBM blockchain podcast that we did a couple months ago. And I think one of the key takeaways from that podcast was that, you really don't have the ability to work with these complex systems if you're putting in bad data. If you think about a roadmap to getting towards working with sophisticated supply chain technologies that are going to be very important, let's say by 2025, you really need to start on data purity, sanctity right now, so that you're able to use those technologies when it's kind of a standard best practice in the industry.
And I think one of the things Rami said was that you have to train AI, right? You have to train it. And I guess if you have bad data, that's like giving a kid a bad textbook, right? They're not going to learn properly. They're going it could go in any, it's a computer, it doesn't have morals. It could go in any crazy direction. If you have weight in there, like you said, you had one that was like 10 million pounds or something ridiculous. If an AI system saw that, how many trucks are going to show up at your warehouse to pick up 10 million pounds of freight?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great example of bad data in, bad data out.
Yeah.
You're never going to be able to get the results that you want if you aren't able to express, a clear picture of what you're doing today. That's true for, both internal benchmarking exercises. If you want to figure out where you can find efficiencies in your supply chain, almost as an internal exercise, you're going to need to understand how and where your goods are moving. And then, to your point, if you're going to work with, some of these more sophisticated technologies that, are really going to be best practices by, say, 2025, 2030. You're never going to be able to work with those unless you have really solid grasp on your supply chain.
We're basically saying it's something that you're going to have to do one way or the other. But there's so many benefits as well. As you've laid out, there's so many benefits in terms of communication within the transportation department, saving money on rates, increased efficiencies. There's environmental benefits of their using a TMS system. You can even put the CO2 footprint of each truck in there, which is beneficial in some countries that look at the eco-friendliness of your supply chain. And that's something that consumers are really starting to look at now too.
Yeah, absolutely. One interesting trend that we've seen in this industry over the last 3 to 5 years has been, the development of kind of a new role for Fortune 100 company. You're starting to see chief supply chain officers, right? Before it was a CEO, a COO, and a CFO. Now you're starting to see a CSCO, which is a chief supply chain officer. And you're starting to see, to your point, you're starting to see environmental impact studies reported in financials to stockholders. I mean, that's really the way that the industry is going. And so to be able to capture that, to be able to measure that, to be able to tell your stockholders about, some of those great wins that you're having and the efficiencies that you're driving, I think that's really powerful information.
Yeah. And to do it, you have to start at day one somewhere. If you want to do it with us, it's day1.io, day01.io. Again, as we said, super simple. Throw your email address in there. We'll give you all of the rest of details when you click Get Optimized. Data scientists will be in touch with you and tell you how to deliver the data. And as Steve even mentioned, there'll even be an NDA. Again, we deal with it all of the time. We deal with data all the time. And I think it's why we're equipped to really do this sort of report carding and road mapping. Well, Steve, thank you very much for your time today. You got to get back to work to start fielding all these new day one requests we have pouring in. But it sounds like the road to the future can start through us, but it also needs to first start through you, the shipper, because you have to start thinking differently about your supply chain and recognize, I don't want to say the storm because it sounds like a bad thing, because I don't know. I'm excited about all this tech. I don't know if you're as excited as I am, Steve, but I think all this stuff is great that's coming down the pike now.
Yeah, absolutely. Working with data, and that's what I get excited about. And just the idea that carriers and shippers and logistics service providers are starting to develop best-in-class data practices. I think that's really exciting for anyone that likes to look at information and figure out how things work.
Looking to modernize, digitize, and future-proof your supply chain? Visit day1.io for a free Day 1 data optimization report. Isn't it time you got optimized? For this episode and all of our previous shows, head on over to, and I've got a quicker address for you guys now, consultinglogistics.io. You can still go to abornandco.com/podcast, but got another site link for you. Got a question for Consulting Logistics? Email me at tdooner@abornandco.com. That's TDOONER@abornandco.com. I'd be happy to learn something new with you. For Steve Aborn, I'm Tim Dooner, saying take care and happy shipping.